The clock stopped. The last time Nora Vale had seen the clock in her uncle's hallway, it had been running 15 minutes fast. By the time she returned to Bellport 3 years later, it had stopped at **11, 13 **. Dead like the man who had owned it. The train left her at the edge of town just after noon, when the sky was the color of wet ash and the sea wind came in hard from the harbor. Bellport looked smaller than she remembered. The row of stone houses leaned against one another as if the weather had worn them down into silence. Fishing nets dried on lines beside the quay. Seagulls screamed over the black water. Everything seemed touched by salt and grief. Nora tightened her coat and walked toward Vale House with her suitcase bumping against the cracked pavement. She had not wanted to come back. Bellport held too many memories she had spent years trying to bury. Her mother's funeral, the long winter after her father left, and her Uncle Silas standing in the doorway of this very house, silent and stern, as if he had known the family would unravel no matter what anyone did to stop it. Silas Vale had been a watchmaker by trade, though the townspeople liked to say he could repair anything with gears in it, clocks, music boxes, even old typewriters. To Nora, he had always seemed like part man and part machine himself. Precise, patient, unmoving. And now he was gone. A message from the local solicitor had reached her 2 days earlier. Your uncle's affairs need attention. There are matters regarding the house. Not your uncle is dead. Not even I'm sorry. Just that cold little sentence, as if death were a clerical inconvenience. By the time she reached the gate, Nora saw the black ribbons tied to the ironwork and the bunches of white lilies beginning to sag in the damp air. Someone had already arranged them for the funeral that morning. The service had been small, held in the church on the hill. She had stood in the back row and watched a handful of Bellport faces turn toward her, some curious, some sympathetic, some politely distant. People in small towns always remembered more than they admitted. She had not stayed afterward. She had come straight here. The front door of Vale House was unlocked, though she was not sure whether that comforted her or made things worse. Inside, the air smelled of dust, oil, old wood, and the faint metallic scent of machinery. The house had the same narrow entryway she remembered from childhood, a long runner on the floor, framed photographs darkened by age, and the clock on the wall with its carved oak face and brass pendulum. It was stopped. Exactly at 11:13. Nora stood still for a moment, one hand still on her suitcase handle. It was absurd, but the number struck her with the force of a physical blow. She knew she had seen it before, somewhere, on a note, on a receipt, in one of her uncle's old ledgers perhaps. He had been fussy about times, always recording them, always correcting the hour on the wall clock even when it was only a minute off. She reached up and touched the wood. Cold. Her uncle had been found in his study 3 days earlier by Mrs. Gibbons next door, who had brought him soup and discovered the door locked from the inside. The doctor had called it a heart attack. The police had agreed. Case closed in under an hour, if the gossip around Bellport was to be believed. But something in that explanation had seemed wrong to Nora from the moment the call came. Silas Vale did not do anything in a hurry, including dying. A voice behind her said, "Miss Vale." Nora turned. A man stood in the doorway of the sitting room, his coat damp from the mist outside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been cut from stone and then softened by years of bad weather. His hair was dark and neatly combed, though one lock had fallen across his forehead. He held a notebook in one hand and a hat in the other. "Detective Rowan Pike," he said. "I was told you'd be arriving today." Nora's first instinct was irritation. By whom? Pike's mouth moved in what might have become a smile if it had traveled any farther. "The solicitor, the church secretary, half the town, I suspect." "Then the town has been busy." "It always is after a death." She did not like the way he looked at her, not in a rude way, but in the careful, measured way people looked at those they expected trouble from. Or perhaps he was simply used to trouble. "I suppose you want to know whether I've found anything suspicious," she said. "I want to know whether you were aware of any reason your uncle might have been under stress." Nora stared at him. He was a watchmaker in a town where nothing ever happened. If that isn't stress, I don't know what is. For the first time, Pike's expression shifted. Not quite amusement, more like he had been warned that she might be sharp and was now confirming the report. "I'll take that as a no," he said. "You can take it as a no." He glanced toward the staircase. "The study remains sealed until the coroner completes the report, but if you're here to collect belongings, I can let you know what the police have inventoried." "You mean what you've decided I'm allowed to see?" "Something like that." She folded her arms. "And what did you decide my uncle died of?" "Natural causes." The words sat between them. Nora looked at the clock in the hallway again. 11:13. "Was he found at that time?" she asked quietly. Pike studied her for a moment. "Why?" She hesitated. "Because the clock is stopped there." "Yes," he said, "it is." "And that doesn't strike you as unusual?" "Miss Vale," he said, his voice even, "a lot of things strike me as unusual. A stopped clock is rarely at the top of the list." She wanted to tell him he was either very clever or very tired. Instead she said, "My uncle was particular. If the clock stopped, he would have fixed it." Pike nodded once, as though filing that away. "Then perhaps it stopped after his death." "Perhaps." He opened his notebook, checked something, and closed it again. "There's one more matter. Your uncle received an unsigned letter 2 days before he died. We found the envelope in his desk." Nora's pulse quickened. "What did it say?" "Nothing useful, just a warning." "About what?" Pike's gaze did not leave hers. "That depends on who you ask." Before she could answer, a car door slammed outside and footsteps crunched across the gravel path. Pike looked toward the front window. "That'll be the solicitor," he said. "I need to speak with him. If you need anything, I'll be in town." Then, as if remembering something, he added, "And Miss Vale." "Yes." "Do not open the study." He left before she could decide whether to be offended. Nora stood in the hall listening to his footsteps fade away. Then the muted murmur of voices outside, the gust of wind against the eaves, the hollow tick of no clock at all. After a moment, she moved toward the sitting room. The furniture was covered with pale dust sheets, but everything else looked exactly as she remembered it. The glass case near the window still held Silas's collection of pocket watches, each one resting on a velvet cushion like a sleeping insect. A brass telescope stood by the fire. Books lined the shelves in uneven towers. On the mantelpiece, beside a cracked photograph of her as a child, was a small brass key. Nora picked it up. It was warm. That was odd enough to make her pause. Keys did not hold heat unless they had just been handled. She looked around. No one. A shadow passed across the window, but when she turned, she saw only the weather and the pale reflection of her own face. The key was attached to a strip of paper folded around it. Nora opened the note. The handwriting was small and slanted, written in dark blue ink. "If you have come back, then it has already begun. Do not trust the police. Look at the clock. 11:13. There was no signature. No address. No explanation. Nora read it twice, then a third time, her skin suddenly prickling under her coat. The words seemed to shift each time she looked at them, as though they were trying to become something else. A sound came from somewhere upstairs. A soft thud. She froze. The house settled around her with the creaks and sighs of old timber, but she knew what she had heard. Someone had moved. Nora slipped the note into her pocket and went still, listening. Nothing. Then from the hall, a second sound, the faint scrape of metal against wood. Her breath caught. She stepped quietly toward the staircase, her shoes soundless on the runner. The banister was polished smooth from years of hands, and for an instant her mind flashed back to being 8 years old, racing Silas up and down these steps while he pretended to scold her for making too much noise. Now the house felt like a held breath. At the bottom of the stairs, near the coat rack, a narrow panel in the wall caught her eye. It was slightly open. She was certain it had been closed before. Nora knelt and touched it. The panel swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a shallow recess behind the plaster. Inside was a small envelope and a folded newspaper clipping. The clipping was yellowed with age. The headline had faded, but she could still make out the date, November 13, 1998 asterisk. Below it was a photograph of a little girl standing beside the harbor wall, her hair blown across her face by the wind. The caption had been cut off. All Nora could read were the words, "Local girl missing after." She stared at it, pulse roaring in her ears. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Inside was a second item, a narrow strip of brass engraved with numbers. Not numbers, she realized after a second glance. A code, or a combination. At the bottom of the strip was a tiny etched mark, a clock face with the hands fixed at 11:13. Nora turned the brass strip over in her hand. Something about it felt deeply wrong, not because of what it was, but because it was so clearly meant for her, or for someone like her, someone who had been expected to come back. From the upper floor came another sound. This time it was unmistakable. A footstep. Slow. Careful. Moving across the landing above her. Nora rose very slowly and looked toward the staircase. The house was supposed to be empty. Her uncle was dead. The study was sealed. So who exactly was walking upstairs? The room behind the wall asterisk. The footsteps upstairs were slow. Not the heavy creak of old wood settling, not the skitter of mice in the roof, not the random noises of a house that had stood too long against the sea. These steps had weight. Purpose. Nora stood at the bottom of the stairs with the brass key still in one hand and the warning note clenched in the other. Her heart had gone so still that she could hear the faint tick of rainwater slipping through the gutter outside. One step. Then another. Someone was above her. She looked toward the staircase. The runner was faded, the banister polished by generations of hands, and the landing above was shadowed by the dim light of the hall lamp. The house, which had seemed so empty a moment ago, now felt crowded with absence, every room holding a silence that had teeth. "Hello," she called before she could stop herself. No answer. Only the soft sound of a floorboard settling somewhere overhead. Nora swallowed and set her suitcase beside the wall. Whatever was up there, she was not leaving it in peace. Not after the message. Not after the clipping. Not after the clock stopped at 11:13 as if time itself had chosen that moment to die. She put one foot on the first stair. The wood gave a dry, complaining groan. She paused, listening. Nothing. She climbed carefully, keeping her weight on the outer edge of each step the way she had once seen her uncle do when he wanted to avoid noise in the night. The smell of the house changed as she rose. Less of dust and furniture polish now, more of old paper and something faintly metallic, like the inside of a drawer full of coins. At the landing she stopped. 3 doors stood open to her left: the guest room, the linen closet, and the narrow room where her uncle had once stored broken clocks waiting for repair. The study door was shut at the far end of the hall, its brass knob sealed with a strip of police tape. But there was a 4th door. One she did not remember. It was at the end of the corridor, half hidden behind a tall grandfather clock draped in a white cloth. The door was slightly ajar, and from the gap came a thin line of pale light. Nora frowned. There had never been a room there before, she was sure of it. She crossed the landing slowly, each step measured, and reached the door. The light beyond it was coming not from a lamp, but from the gray afternoon leaking through a small attic window. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was narrow and unfinished, the sort of space builders sometimes left behind when a house was altered over the years, and no one bothered to make the changes elegant. The ceiling slanted sharply. Roof beams crossed overhead in dark lines. Boxes were stacked in the corners, many of them labeled in her uncle's angular handwriting. Spare parts asterisk asterisk, asterisk asterisk winter clothes asterisk asterisk, broken movements asterisk asterisk, ledgers asterisk asterisk. The word made her stomach tighten. She stepped inside. The footsteps had stopped. The silence felt deliberate now, as if the house were waiting to see what she would do. There was a workbench against the far wall with tools laid out in precise rows, tiny screwdrivers, tweezers, files, clock hands, and coils of wire. A lantern sat beside them unlit. The room smelled stronger here of oil and dust, but underneath it was something else, fresh tobacco. Her uncle had never smoked. Nora moved to the bench and saw, tucked beneath a stack of folded cloth, a small brass watch. She picked it up. It was warm. Too warm. As if someone had just set it down. She flipped open the case. The face inside was cracked, and the hands were stopped at asterisk asterisk 11, 13 asterisk asterisk. Her breath caught. On the inside back cover was an engraving she had not noticed at first. MV. Her initials. Or her mother S. Before she could examine it further, she heard a creak behind her. She spun around. No one. But the attic hatch above the landing was open now, just a finger's width, and a thread of colder air drifted down from it. Nora stared at the opening, every muscle in her body tightening. Someone had been there recently. Someone had left it ajar. Then she noticed the floor. A narrow line of muddy water crossed the boards from the hatch to the workbench. Not much, just enough to show the outline of a boot heel. And another. Nora crouched and touched the damp board. It was not rainwater. It smelled faintly of sea salt and soot, as if it had been tracked in from the harbor. Her pulse began to pound. She stood and crossed to the workbench again, scanning the room more carefully now. Beneath the lantern was a shallow drawer. It slid open with a squeal of metal. Inside was a stack of folded papers, a railway timetable, and a map of Bellport with several locations marked in red ink. The marks clustered around the harbor, the old lighthouse road, the church hill, and one circle drawn very heavily around the town bank. At the bottom of the drawer lay a leather notebook tied with string. Nora opened it. The pages were filled with her uncle's handwriting, small, neat lines of dates, names, times, and fragments of information that seemed to have been copied from somewhere else. Some entries were simple enough. June 4, Mrs. Gibbons received parcel from Ashford. June 11, Pike asking about old records. Aug 2, refinery shipment delayed. But as she turned the pages, her eye caught repeated references to the same time. 11:13. Over and over. A time in the margin, a time circled, a time underlined so many times the paper had nearly torn. Then she found the page dated asterisk November 13, 1998 asterisk. The handwriting changed slightly there, becoming harder and more uneven. 11:13 Harbor Bell, witness confirmed. 11:13 Girl seen near wall. 11:13 Do not let them say accident. 11:13 If I speak they will know. Nora stared. Her mouth had gone dry. Below those lines was a final note, written in darker ink as if added later. She was not the first. A sharp knock sounded downstairs. Nora nearly jumped out of her skin. The notebook slipped in her hands and thudded against the floorboards. Miss Vale, a man called from below. It's Croft, the solicitor. She pressed a hand to her chest and looked toward the attic hatch. The footsteps were gone, but the house no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by secrets. "I'll be down in a moment," she called, hoping her voice did not sound as strained as it felt. "Detective Pike is with me," Croft said. "He'd like to speak with you." Nora stuffed the notebook back into the drawer, though not before pulling out the brass watch and slipping it into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed the papers again, and one loose sheet fluttered to the floor. She snatched it up and froze. It was a photocopy of a newspaper clipping, the same one she had found behind the wall. The Missing Girl article from 1998. Only this copy had a handwritten note in the margin. "Ask about the bell, ask about the house, ask why the witness moved away 2 days later." The note was in her uncle's hand. Her stomach turned. The witness moved away 2 days later. She stared at the photograph on the clipping. A young girl stood by the harbor wall, her face partly turned from the camera, wind blowing hair across her cheek. Nora thought, with a sudden sharp unease, that there was something familiar about the curve of the jaw, the shape of the eyes. Too familiar. She shoved the clipping into her pocket just as footsteps approached the stairs. Nora smoothed her coat and headed down the corridor. Detective Rowan Pike stood in the hall with his notebook in one hand and a frown that deepened when he saw her. Beside him was Mr. Croft, a thin man with a waxed mustache and an expression of permanent apology. He held a folder under one arm and looked as though he would rather be anywhere else. "Miss Vale," Croft said, adjusting his glasses, "I'm terribly sorry for the delay. There are several matters we need to discuss regarding the estate." Nora noted the way Pike's eyes flicked toward the staircase behind her. "You've been upstairs," he said. "Not a question." Nora met his gaze. "It's my uncle's house." "Yes," he said, "and the study is sealed." "I didn't go into the study." "That's not what I asked." Croft made a small sound of discomfort and opened his folder. "Perhaps we should begin with the practical concerns. There is the matter of the will, the inventory, and the—" "Did you find anything else in the house?" Pike interrupted. Croft blinked. "I'm sorry." Pike's expression did not change. "Any papers missing? Any hidden compartments? Any sign someone else has been here?" Nora felt her coat pocket, where the notebook's copied clipping now rested against the brass watch. "No," she lied. Pike watched her for a beat longer than necessary. Then, to Croft's obvious relief, he turned away and looked toward the hall table where the stopped clock sat under a veil of dust. "The clock," he said. "Your uncle always kept it running." "Always," Nora replied before she could stop herself. "He said a clock that stopped was a confession." Pike glanced at her. "A confession of what?" That time had won. For the first time, something resembling curiosity crossed his face. "Your uncle was fond of dramatic sayings." "He was fond of precision." Croft cleared his throat. "If I may, there is one item missing from the house inventory, a set of papers from Silas's study. The police assumed they'd been removed before the room was sealed." Pike turned a page in his notebook. "We assumed nothing. We found no trace of them." "No trace," Nora repeated. "Yes." Her hand closed around the brass watch in her pocket. "What kind of papers?" Croft hesitated. "Old records, mostly financial, some local correspondence." Pike looked at him. "That is an extremely generous description." Croft flushed. "Mr. Vale was a private man." "Yes," said Pike, "he was." Nora watched the exchange carefully. There was something in the detective's tone, something not openly hostile but weighted with familiarity. He had known Silas long enough to dislike him, or respect him, or both. "Detective Pike," she said, "why did you really come back?" Pike's eyes shifted to hers. "Because your uncle died in a room with the door locked from the inside, and because there was a warning letter in his desk. and because I don't like coincidences." Nora held his gaze. "Neither do I." Croft looked between them and decided, wisely, to pretend he had not heard that. "Perhaps," he said, "we should proceed with the will reading tomorrow, once Miss Vale has had time to settle in." "Tomorrow is fine," Nora said. Pike's expression said he did not believe her for 1 second. They spoke for another few minutes about practicalities: insurance, paperwork, the state of the roof, the need for a locksmith in case the study remained locked after the police completed their inspection. Nora answered as little as possible. All the while she felt the weight of the hidden notebook in her pocket like a live coal. At last Croft left, promising to return in the morning with copies of the inventory. Pike lingered. Nora expected him to leave too, but instead he remained by the front door with one hand resting on the frame. The fading daylight outside had turned his coat a darker shade of gray. For a moment he looked less like a detective and more like a man who had spent too many years expecting bad news. "Your uncle was asking questions," he said quietly. Nora kept still. "About what?" 26 years ago there was a disappearance in Bellport. A girl named Elsie Morrow." He paused. "You were too young to remember much of it, I'd imagine." The floor seemed to shift under Nora's feet. Elsie Morrow. The name was not familiar, but the date was November 13, 1998. She did remember that year. Or pieces of it. The harbor siren in the fog, her mother crying in the kitchen, Sila's arriving late one evening with rain on his coat and no explanation, a locked drawer she had once been told never to touch. "Why is her name in my uncle's notebook?" Nora asked. Pike studied her face. "That's what I'm trying to find out." "Was the girl found?" "No." Her throat tightened, and the police just gave up. "We had a witness who changed their statement," Pike said. "Then they moved away. The case lost shape after that." "What witness?" Pike did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had gone carefully flat. "Your mother." Nora went cold. "My mother was dead by then." Pike's jaw flexed once, the only sign of surprise. "I know." The silence that followed seemed to widen the hallway around them. Nora stared at him. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying your uncle kept files on that case for years. I'm saying he was still asking questions recently, and I'm saying he may have had a reason to be worried." She took a slow breath. "And you think I know something?" "I think your uncle believed you might." Her pulse thudded painfully. "That doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to." He reached into his coat and took out a small evidence bag. Inside was a brass strip, identical to the one Nora had found hidden in the wall. The one with the engraved clock face and the numbers. "Recognize this?" he asked. Nora's hand went automatically to her pocket. For a second she thought he somehow knew what she had found. Then she realized he did not. He was waiting for a reaction. She shook her head. "Should I?" Pike held the bag up to the light. "We found one in your uncle's study desk. There was also a note beside it." "What note?" He hesitated. "It said, 'She will come back when the clock stops.'" Nora felt the blood drain from her face. "That's ridiculous," she said, but the words sounded thin even to her. "Yes," Pike said, "it is." He did not say anything else after that. Instead he looked past her, up the staircase, as if listening to something she could not hear. Then he lowered the evidence bag and slipped it back into his pocket. "If you remember anything," he said, "anything at all, call me first. Not the solicitor, not the church, me." "You really don't trust your own police department much, do you?" "No," he said, "I don't." That should have reassured her. It did not. When he left, the front door shut with a careful click that sounded too final. Nora stood in the hall for a moment, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps on the path, then turned slowly to face the stairs. The house was quiet again. Not empty, quiet. She drew the notebook clipping from her pocket and looked at the photograph. The girl in the picture stared back at her with a half-turned face and dark hair blown across one eye. And then Nora noticed something she had missed before. On the girl's wrist was a narrow blue ribbon. The same kind her mother had once tied around Nora's wrist when she was small. Her breath caught. That was impossible. She stared harder at the photograph, the old paper blurring at the edges. The girl looked no older than 10, maybe 11. Nora was 31. The resemblance was not exact, but it was close enough to make her stomach twist. Too close. She moved without deciding to. Up the stairs again, faster now, the notebook clutched in one hand and the brass watch in the other. Back in the attic room, the air felt colder than before. The lamp on the workbench had not been lit, but the gray window light had shifted enough to throw the objects into stark relief. Tools, papers, dust, the open drawer. And one thing that had not been there before. A small envelope lay on the center of the workbench. Nora stopped dead. She had not seen anyone come in. Pike had not gone upstairs. Croft was long gone, yet the envelope sat there as if placed by a patient hand. She crossed the room and picked it up. No seal, no name, just her own initials written across the front. NV. Inside was a single key and a piece of lined paper folded in half. The key was tiny, old-fashioned, and blackened with age. Not for a house door, something smaller, a drawer, a box, a locker. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was not her uncle's. It was neat, slanting, and unfamiliar. If you found the brass watch, then they are watching the house again. Do not trust the man in the coat. The key opens locker 113 at Bellport Bank. And Nora, if you start remembering the harbor, run. Below the message, written in a different hand, was one final line. He did not die alone. Nora stared at the words until they seemed to float apart. A sound came from behind her. Not a footstep this time. A soft exhale. Someone was in the room with her. She turned sharply. The attic was empty. Then the lantern on the workbench flickered once, though no one had touched it. And from somewhere inside the wall, very close, just beyond the plaster, came 3 slow knocks. 1, 2, 3. Then a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Nora. She did not move. The whisper came again, from the wall beside the grandfather clock downstairs, carried upward through the bones of the house. Nora, don't open the study. Locker 113. Nora did not answer the whisper. Not because she was brave, and not because she was calm, but because every instinct she possessed had gone suddenly, spectacularly still. The attic room seemed to shrink around her. The lantern on the workbench gave a weak flicker. Dust hung in the air like a paused snowfall. The voice had come from inside the wall, close enough that she could have sworn warm breath touched the back of her neck. Nora turned once slowly. Nothing. No shadow, no movement, no figure where there should not have been one. Only the grandfather clock downstairs, silent under its white cloth, and the dim light slanting through the attic window. "Who's there?" she asked. Her own voice sounded wrong in the room, too loud, too human. No answer came. The silence afterward was worse. She took one step toward the doorway, then stopped and looked back at the workbench. The envelope, the key, the warning note, everything had been placed there for her with the certainty of a hand she could not see. Someone had expected her to come back. Someone had expected her to find the box. Someone wanted her moving in the right direction, or perhaps exactly the wrong one. Nora slipped the paper into her coat pocket, picked up the tiny blackened key, and left the attic as quietly as she could. By the time she reached the hall, the front door had begun to rattle in the wind. She stared at the grandfather clock beneath its cloth. The shape under the cover was tall and brooding, like a person standing in the corner. She had the oddest sensation that if she lifted the cloth, she would not find a clock at all, but something more patient and more dangerous. She did not lift it. Instead, she went to the hall table, retrieved her suitcase, and called the solicitor's office from the old telephone in the sitting room. No one answered. She left a message she did not really mean, saying she would be out for the afternoon and would return later. Then she took the brass watch from her pocket, the envelope and the copied clipping, and she went to Bellport Bank. The bank stood 3 streets from the harbor, in a building of gray stone that had been built in a different century, when people trusted locks more than people and money still felt like something heavy enough to store in walls. The sign above the door read *Bellport SAVINGS and Loan * in faded gold letters. Nora pushed through the doors and was met by warmth, polished wood, and the smell of paper, metal, and old carpet. The place was quiet except for the soft clicking of keys and the low hum of a ceiling fan. A round-faced woman behind the counter looked up at her over wire-rimmed glasses. "Can I help you?" Nora stepped forward. "I'm Nora Vale. I need access to a safety deposit box." The woman's expression changed by a fraction. Not surprise exactly. Recognition, perhaps. Bellport had never really forgotten the Vale family. "Do you have the key?" Nora held it out. The woman glanced at it and nodded once, as if a hidden door in her memory had just opened. "Locker 113, she said. "Right, wait here." Nora waited under a portrait of the bank's founder, whose eyes followed her with painted suspicion. Outside the front windows, the sky had darkened to the color of iron. She could see rain coming in from the harbor, a low silver curtain moving over the roofs. A clock hung above the teller's desks. It read **11, 13**. Nora stared at it. For a moment she thought it must be broken, but then one of the bank clerks reached up and tapped the glass with a pen. "Stuck again," the clerk muttered to no one in particular. "Needs resetting." Something cold moved through Nora's chest. The woman at the counter returned with a small brass tray and a clipboard. "I'll need you to sign here, Miss Vale. There has to be a record." Nora signed her name, though her hand did not feel like it belonged to her. The woman glanced at the signature, then at Nora's face. "You're Silas Vale's niece." "Yes. I'm sorry for your loss." Nora nodded because there was nothing else to do with an apology in a room full of old paper and locked things. The woman led her through a narrow corridor to the vault, where the light changed and the air became colder, drier, stripped of anything living. The vault door was open just enough to reveal rows of numbered metal boxes. Locker 113 sat at about waist height, its brass plate dulled by time. The key turned with a reluctant click. The drawer slid out. Inside was a small black tin box bound with twine. Nora took it carefully and set it on the table provided in the vault alcove. The woman waited politely a few steps back, pretending not to watch. Nora untied the string. The lid lifted with a dry sigh. The first thing she saw was a photograph. It was old, the edges curled slightly, the image faded but clear enough. 2 girls stood on the harbor wall in summer light, their hair blown by the wind. One was younger, perhaps 9 or 10. The other was Nora. She stared. It was her. Not a vague resemblance, not a trick of the eye. Her own face looked back at her from the past, younger and rounder, with a shy smile and one hand clutching the sleeve of the other girl beside her. Nora's breath caught hard enough to hurt. She did not remember the photograph. She did not remember the day. And yet the sight of it sent a shock through her body, the way a forgotten smell can suddenly drag an entire season out of hiding. The other girl had dark hair, blunt cut at the chin, and a serious expression that made her look older than she should have been. Around her wrist was the same narrow blue ribbon Nora had noticed in the newspaper clipping. On the back of the photo, in her uncle's handwriting, Nora and Elsie, 1998. Do not let them tell you otherwise. Her fingers tightened. Under the photo was a folded ledger page, then a cassette tape in a paper sleeve. Then at the bottom of the tin, wrapped in a handkerchief, a small brass pendant shaped like a clock hand. Nora took the tape first. On its label, written in black ink, were 3 words: "If you return." Below that, in smaller writing, 11:13/harbor/listen alone. Her pulse had begun to race too fast now, too hard to think around. The ledger page trembled in her hands as she unfolded it. It was not a financial ledger as she had expected, or not only that. The page contained dates, amounts, names, and initials, all in columns. Some lines had been crossed out. Some were underlined in red. A few bore notes in her uncle's precise script. Payment received. Witness relocation arranged. Harbor report altered. Bell Tower maintenance funds routed through church account. And then, lower down, a line that made her stomach go cold. If Nora asks, deny the second girl existed. She read that sentence 3 times before she believed it was there. The second girl. Elsie. The woman at the counter behind her cleared her throat softly, not impatiently, just with the quiet insistence of someone who knew she was standing too close to a family secret. Would you like me to seal the box again, Miss Vale? Nora looked up, disoriented. Yes, she said too quickly. Then, because her voice sounded strange to her, she added, no, wait, 1 more minute. The woman stepped back. Nora reached for the brass pendant. It was heavier than it looked, shaped like the hand of a clock pointing upward. The back of it had a tiny engraved number, *113***. She turned the cassette over in her palm. It felt absurdly ordinary. A plastic rectangle, no different from any other piece of dead technology. And yet it seemed to vibrate with a hidden purpose, like a wasp trapped inside a jar. A memory flickered at the edge of her mind. Not a full scene. Just a sensation. Cold sea air, the clang of a bell, her mother's hand on her shoulder, someone speaking urgently from the shadows near the harbor steps. Nora shut her eyes. The memory vanished before she could catch it. When she opened them again, the bank was still, the locker open, the woman waiting, the ceiling lights giving everything a flat hospital brightness. Nora slid the photo into her coat pocket and wrapped the tape and ledger page back into the handkerchief. She was almost done when something else slipped free from the bottom of the tin box. A key. Not the same as the one she had used to open the locker. This one was long and narrow with a decorative bow, old iron blackened by age. Attached to it was a scrap of paper, folded so tightly it had nearly torn where the crease had worn through. She opened it. Her uncle's handwriting again. Only 2 lines. The key opens the church bellroom. If you hear the clock at 11:13, do not look at the water. Nora stared at the note. Then at the ledger page. Then at the photograph of herself and Elsie standing together in the sunlight, as if nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. A chill moved through her that had nothing to do with the bank's cold vault air. The woman behind her said gently, Miss Vale. Nora turned. The locker time is up, if you need to come back. Do you remember Elsie Morrow? Nora asked. The woman blinked, then looked faintly uncomfortable. Miss Morrow. Yes. The woman hesitated. I was young then. I remember there was a lot of talk, nothing useful. Why? Nora held the photograph out. The woman took one look at it and her face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. She looked from the photo to Nora, then down again. I never knew, she said quietly. Knew what? But the woman had already regretted saying anything. I shouldn't comment on old things. Nora folded the photograph away and closed the tin box herself. No, she said, I don't suppose you should. She relocked locker 113 with the same key and returned the brass tray. The woman escorted her back through the corridor and into the main room of the bank, where the wall clock still read 11:13. The second Nora saw it, the hairs rose on her arms. The clock face was not broken. The hands were still. No one in the bank seemed to notice. She reached the front doors, and only then did she feel the weight of being watched. Not by one person. By several. Across the street, partly hidden under the awning of the closed apothecary, stood Detective Rowan Pike. His coat collar was up against the rain, his notebook tucked beneath one arm. He did not smile when he saw her. He simply watched, as if the bank doors had opened not onto a street, but onto a lie he had been waiting to catch. Nora stepped outside and shut the door behind her. The rain had begun in earnest now, fine and cold, misting over the road and turning the harbor into a blur. Bellport looked washed of color. The stone buildings darkened. The gulls vanished into the low clouds. Pike crossed the street and stopped a few feet away. You move quickly, he said. You sound surprised. I'm not. His eyes dropped briefly to the shape of the tin box under her coat arm, then returned to her face. Did you find what you were looking for? Nora smiled without warmth. Did you follow me here? Yes. Why? Because your uncle's house is full of missing time, and because safety deposit boxes don't usually stay locked if a dead man has left instructions. She stared at him. You knew about locker 113. I knew it existed, but not what was inside. No, it was impossible to tell if he was lying. That, Nora was learning, was one of his better skills. He looked past her toward the bank doors. You shouldn't stay in town tonight. Her brows drew together. That sounds less like advice and more like a threat. Take it how you like. A gust of rain swept down the street, hard enough to sting. Nora adjusted her grip on the box and saw, just for a second, the reflection of Pike's face in the bank window behind him. The image was warped by the glass, but it looked almost like someone standing beside him. Someone with a hat. Someone she could not quite make out. She turned sharply, but the street behind Pike was empty. When she looked back, he was still watching her. There's a reason your uncle kept asking about Elsie Morrow, he said. If you want the truth, you need to stop chasing shadows and start asking why your family lies so well. Nora's jaw tightened. My family. Pike's expression changed, only slightly. You should go home. To the house. He said nothing. That was answer enough. Nora clutched the box under her coat. You're not as subtle as you think you are, detective. No, he said, I'm usually worse. He stepped back then, letting her pass, though there was something about the movement that felt less like courtesy and more like a decision. A choice to let her walk into something he either could not stop or did not want to name yet. Nora did not trust him. But she did not trust the town more. She turned away from him and walked fast, not toward Vale House, but toward the harbor road. The note about the church bell room burned in her pocket. The photograph of herself and Elsie felt like a live thing against her ribs. As she moved through the rain, the town began to shift in the way places do when one sees them with new eyes. The church on the hill was older than the others, its stone tower dark against the sky. The bell rope room would be high above the pews, narrow and cold, full of dust and old echoes. She had not intended to go there. Yet every clue she had found pulled in that direction. The bank ledger, the key, the clock at 11:13, the warning not to look at the water. The harbor was right below the church hill. Nora stopped at the foot of the slope and looked down toward the sea. Rain thickened over the docks. The water was the color of lead, and the harbor wall could barely be seen through the mist. For a moment, she had the ridiculous, sudden impression that something below the surface had moved. A shape, a memory, or both. She shivered and turned toward the church steps. Halfway up, she felt something slip from the inside of the ledger page. A smaller note, tucked between the folds, had escaped her notice in the bank. She unfolded it with numb fingers. Only 3 words were written there. It was her. Nora stood still on the wet stone steps, rain striking the paper, the church rising above her in a dark shape of stone and silence. She did not know whether the words meant Elsie, her mother, or someone else entirely. But she knew, with a certainty that made her knees weaken, that the story had just begun to show its real face. The bell room. The church stood at the top of the hill like something left behind by a vanished age, stone blackened by weather, narrow windows turned blind by rain, and a bell tower rising above the town as if it had been built to watch over Bellport rather than bless it. Nora climbed the steps with the ledger page folded in her pocket, and the words it was her asterisk beating at the back of her mind. Rain slicked the stone beneath her shoes. The churchyard was empty except for a pair of crows huddled on the iron fence and a dead wreath hanging crooked from the gate. The harbor below had vanished into gray mist. Beyond it, the sea looked less like water than a sheet of metal. By the time she reached the doors, her breath had gone shallow. The church entrance was heavy oak with old iron hinges. She tested the handle and found it unlocked. Inside, the air was colder than outside. It smelled of damp wood, candle wax, and dust that had been undisturbed for years. The nave was dim, lit by the pale leak of daylight through stained glass. The windows showed saints in faded reds and blues, their faces softened by age into expressions of tired patience. Nora stepped inside, and the door shut softly behind her. The silence in the church was different from the silence in Vale House. The house had held secrets like a locked mouth. The church held them like a grave. "Can I help you?" The voice came from the side aisle. Nora turned. A man in a dark cassock stood near the vestry door, tall and thin, with silver hair and a face carved by old concern. He wore no cross, only a plain ring on one hand. His eyes were sharp despite his age. "Father," Nora said, because the collar left little room for doubt, "I'm Nora Vale." Recognition flickered across his face. "Yes," he said quietly, "Silas's niece." She hesitated. "You knew my uncle." "Most of Bellport knew your uncle." His gaze shifted to the paper in her hand. "He came here often enough." "Did he?" The priest studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much truth her face could bear. "My name is Father Adrian Hale," he said at last. "If you're here about the bell room, I expect you've had a reason to come." That made Nora tense. "I have a key." Father Hale's expression changed only slightly, but she saw it. Not surprise, concern. "Then your uncle left it for you. You knew about the key." "I knew he carried one." He folded his hands. "He asked me once to keep the tower locked." "Asked you when?" "Long ago." "How long ago?" Father Hale's eyes lowered for a moment toward the church floor. 26 years. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. That number again. Not a coincidence now, not even close. "I need to see the bell room," she said. The priest did not answer immediately. Somewhere high above them, wind sighed against the tower windows. A candle near the altar trembled, though there was no draught in the nave. At last he said, "If you go up there, Miss Vale, do not touch anything in the east alcove." "Why?" "Because I asked you not to." It was not a reason, but it was enough to tell her he was serious. Nora held his gaze. Was my uncle hiding something? Father Hale looked at her for a long moment. "Your uncle was trying to keep Bellport from remembering." Before she could ask what that meant, He turned and led her to the side passage that opened into the bell tower stairs. The staircase wound upward in a narrow spiral, each step worn uneven by generations of feet. The stone walls were damp and close around her, and every few turns a small window offered a glimpse of the harbor through rain-blurred glass. Nora climbed in silence behind the priest, the key clenched in her hand. Halfway up, she noticed something scratched into the stone wall. At first she thought it was a mark from some old repair, but then she leaned closer and saw the letters had been cut deliberately into the mortar. 1113. Below the numbers, almost hidden by age and grime, was a second line. Do not let the bell ring twice. Nora stopped. Father Hale turned, his expression unreadable in the dim stairwell. What is it? She pointed to the wall. His face closed in on itself, not quite with fear, but with the kind of resignation that comes when a long-buried thing proves it is still alive. Your uncle found that, he said quietly. He asked me to have it removed. Why didn't you? Because I knew who cut it there. Nora stared at him. Who? He did not answer. They climbed the last stretch in silence. At the top of the tower, a narrow wooden door stood beneath a brass latch blackened by years of hands. Nora slid the tiny key into the lock. It turned with a soft click that sounded much louder than it should have. The door opened inward. The bell room beyond was smaller than she expected, almost cramped. A huge bronze bell hung overhead in a timber frame, dark with age and green where the metal had oxidized. Thick rope ran from the bell down through a pulley system to a floor ring. Dust lay over everything in a pale skin. 3 tiny windows, one on each side, looked out over Bellport. The harbor was directly below the east window. Nora felt her stomach tighten. Something about the room was wrong. Not simply old, not simply unused. There was a discomfort in the air, a sense that the room had once been arranged for a purpose, and then abandoned before the purpose could be forgotten. On the far wall sat a narrow table with a cloth over it. Beside it were a few candles, a rusted key hook, and a small wooden cabinet built into the stone. Father Hale stayed at the threshold. I'm not coming in, he said. You seem very sure I should. You're the one who asked. Nora did not miss the note of warning in his voice, but her attention had already moved to the cabinet. Its lock was old and plain. The key from the banknote fit perfectly. Inside were folded records, parish maintenance logs, and one metal tin box wrapped in blue ribbon. Blue. Her fingers stilled. She took the tin box out slowly and set it on the table. The ribbon had faded but was tied in a neat knot. She loosened it with trembling hands. Inside was a stack of papers and a cassette tape. Not one tape, 3. The first had a label written in her uncle's hand. May 12, 1999, Bell Room. The second. Morrow Statement, copy asterisk. The third. Nora, if she remembers. Her pulse spiked so hard she had to steady herself against the table. Father Hale's voice came from the door, low and strained. You should not listen to those here. Then why keep them here? Because your uncle insisted. Nora ignored him and reached for the first cassette. A tape recorder sat in the cabinet beneath the records, old and dusty, but apparently maintained. She slid the cassette into place and pressed play. There was a burst of static. Then a man's voice. Sila's. It was unmistakably him. Measured, dry, and carrying the same controlled irritation Nora remembered from childhood. I'm telling you, Adrian, the bell was rung at 11:13, not 11:12, not 11:14, exactly 11:13. That matters. Another voice replied, quieter and younger, with strain under the calm. I'm saying I don't know why that matters. You do know. A pause, a scrape of wood, perhaps a chair shifting. Then a woman's voice. Nora froze. It was soft, tired, and unmistakably familiar. Her mother. Silas, the voice said, stop pushing. If you push her, you'll lose what's left. Nora could not breathe. Her mother was dead. Had been dead for years before Nora came back to Bellport, before the bank locker, before the note in the wall. And yet there she was, on the tape, speaking as plainly as if she had walked into the room that morning. The recording continued. Silas said she saw something. No, her mother replied, she was there. Nora's grip tightened on the table edge. There was a burst of static, then the tape picked up again. A different voice now, male, younger, nervous. We can't keep this here, not after the report. You already altered the report, Silas snapped. I altered what I had to. And the witness. She won't talk if she's scared enough. Her mother said sharply, don't you dare. The next words came all at once, overlapping. No one is taking her to the harbor. If the police knew what was below the wall. The second girl was never supposed to be seen. The tape crackled violently and jumped forward. Then silence. Nora realized her hands had gone numb. She looked up at Father Hale. Play it again. The priest's face had gone pale. No. Play it. He held her gaze for a moment, then shook his head. That recording is why I stopped coming up here. What recording? The one your uncle made after the disappearance. Nora stared at him. You knew. Yes. Then why didn't you tell anyone? Father Hale's jaw tightened. Because the town didn't want it told. That answer would have made her angry if she weren't already drowning in the sound of her own heartbeat. She rewound the tape and pressed play again, this time fast-forwarding through the static until a different section emerged. Silas's voice, lower and rougher than before. If this goes to the police, they'll bury it. Adrian, look at me. They have already chosen the story. Another voice, unmistakably her mother's. Silas, enough. Nora is in the house. Nora's whole body went cold. Her mother's voice on the tape sharpened. You said she wouldn't remember. Silas answered, not now, later maybe. It depends what they've done. A pause, then her mother's softer. Then don't let her near the water. The recording clicked and ended. Nora stared at the tape deck as if it might speak again on its own. Her mouth had gone dry. Her mother's voice had felt real enough to reach out and touch, real enough to hurt. Father Hale stepped forward for the first time and looked at the cassette, as if it were an animal he would prefer not to wake. This was recorded 2 days before Elsie Morrow vanished, he said. Nora jerked her head up. Elsie was on this tape. Yes. What did she say? The priest hesitated. Not much, she was frightened. Of what? He did not answer. Instead, he moved to the small window overlooking the harbor and looked out through the rain. Nora followed his gaze. The water below was dark and restless, breaking against the harbor wall in thin white teeth. It struck her then, with a clarity so sudden it made her dizzy, that the church tower had a direct view of the exact section of waterfront where the missing girl had last been seen. Why keep a record up here? Nora asked. Why not in the church office? Because your uncle believed the room was safe. Safe from who? Father Hale looked back at her. From whoever was listening through the walls. Before Nora could respond, a sound rose from below. Not footsteps. A bell. The church bell gave one deep, shuddering toll that shook dust from the beams overhead. Nora flinched hard enough to slam her hand against the table. The bell should not have sounded. The rope was still, the room empty except for her and the priest. Another toll followed, then a third, though no one touched the mechanism. Then all at once, the bell began to ring in a hard, rhythmical pattern, slow, deliberate, and utterly impossible. Father Hale went rigid. No, he whispered. Nora turned to him. What is happening? but he was already moving toward the door. The bell rang again. And again. Down the stairwell came a rush of air, as if the tower had exhaled. Then from somewhere beneath the ringing, Nora heard something else. Water. Not rain. Not the sea outside. Water moving inside the church. Her skin prickled. The floorboards at her feet gave a soft, sickening shift. Father Hale grabbed the doorframe. Get away from the east wall. Nora did not ask why. She stepped backward just as a sound like cracking bone came from the stonework beside the window. A narrow seam opened in the wall. Dust spilled out. Then, with a slow grinding scrape, a section of the stone panel slid inward. A hidden recess. Nora stared. Inside was a small shelf, and on it, a metal box no larger than a shoebox. The surface was rusted, the latch corroded. Across the top someone had painted a number in white, long ago nearly flaked away. 113. The bell struck again. And through the open seam in the wall came a smell Nora had not expected to find inside a church tower. Salt water. Cold and sharp, as if the sea had been sealed behind the stone for years and had only now found its way out. Father Hale made a sound between a curse and a prayer. Don't open that box. Nora looked at him, then at the box, then at the wall where the water smell was growing stronger. Why not? Because it's not for you. The bell rang once more. Then from deep below them came a second sound. A human voice. Faint, muffled. Calling up through the wall. Nora. She froze. The voice came again, clearer this time, pressed thin through stone and water. Nora Vale. Her blood turned to ice. That was not her mother. That was not her uncle. It was a man. A man who should not have been able to speak from inside the church wall. Father Hale backed away from the recess, face drained of color. No, he said again, but this time it sounded less like refusal and more like recognition. Nora stared at the rusted box, at the crack in the wall, at the water beads shining on the stone. Then the voice from inside the wall spoke one more time, and this time she recognized it. Detective Rowan Pike. He sounded exhausted, furious, and trapped. Nora, he said, if you can hear me, don't let them know you found the bell room. The floor shuddered beneath her feet. And somewhere below the church, something heavy slammed against metal. The flooded passage. The bell did not stop ringing. It sounded once more through the tower, a heavy bronze air that seemed to shake the dust from the stones themselves. Nora stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the narrow boards. The air in the bell room had changed, colder now, wetter, with the sharp scent of salt water rising up through the cracks in the floor. Father Hale had gone pale. Enough, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. That should not be happening. Nora looked from him to the seam in the east wall. Water had begun to bead along the mortar there. Not much at first, just a few silver drops, but enough to make the stone glisten as if something behind it was breathing. The voice came again. Miss Vale. Pike. This time there was no doubt. He sounded close, but not in the room. He sounded buried behind it. Nora's pulse slammed hard in her throat. Detective Pike. A pause, then his voice, lower and strained. Yes, and unless you want me to drown in a church wall, I suggest you stop staring at me and open the box. Father Hale whirled around. How do you know he's there? I can hear him, Nora snapped. You can hear what's left of him, the priest said, and immediately seemed to regret the words. That was enough to make Nora step toward the recess in the wall. The rusted metal box sat on the shelf inside, its lid warped by age and damp. The number *113 had been painted on top in flaking white. It looked old enough to belong to a different century, old enough to have survived long after whatever had been meant to keep it hidden had failed. She crouched and reached in carefully. The box came free with a shallow scrape. Water dripped from the underside onto the floorboards. Nora carried it to the table and set it down with care. Father Hale stood at the threshold, his face unreadable now, his hands clasped so tightly they had gone white at the knuckles. "Do not open it yet," he said. "Why?" "Because once you do, you won't be able to pretend you don't know." Nora gave him a flat look. "I'm already past pretending." She unlatched the corroded clasp. The lid lifted with a small metallic sigh. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, a narrow tape cassette, a folded church record, and a small object tied in blue ribbon. Nora picked up the object first. It was a child's bracelet. Not expensive, not ornamental, just a thin band of silvered metal stamped with two initials. MV. Her fingers trembled. She knew those initials. Or she knew that she should know them. There was a memory at the edge of her mind, soft and slippery, of a woman's hand fastening something around her wrist when she was very young. A voice saying, "If you get lost, remember your name." Nora swallowed and set the bracelet down. The folded record was a parish ledger page. She opened it and saw dates, names and numbers written in a cramped hand. One line had been marked several times in red pencil. NOV 13/11, 13/tower lock/witness removed. Below it was another note in her uncle's handwriting. Mara was right, they used the bell room. Nora looked up sharply. Father Hale's eyes had closed for a moment, as if in prayer. "Mara," she said. His silence was answer enough. "My mother." He opened his eyes. "Yes." The word hit her with more force than she expected. Not because she had forgotten her mother's name, she had not, but because hearing it here in this room, written in her uncle's hand, made it feel newly real. Not a memory, a person. Her mother had not just existed, she had been part of this. Nora reached for the tape cassette. The label was smudged but still readable. MARA, if NORA returns. She stared at it for a moment, a chill crawling slowly down her spine. Then she slid the cassette into the recorder beside the cabinet and pressed play. At first there was only static. Then a click. A breath. Her mother's voice filled the bell room. It was older than Nora remembered, but unmistakable, warm, tired, with a faint strain that made every word sound as if it had been carried a long way before reaching her. "If this tape is being played," her mother said, "then the worst has already happened or the truth is finally catching up. Silas, if you're listening, I told you not to make a record." Silas Vale's voice cut in, sharp and low. "And I told you, I won't let Bellport bury another child." A pause. Then her mother again, quieter this time. "It's already buried one." Nora leaned closer to the machine. The tape crackled. Another voice entered, male, younger, unfamiliar. "Please," the man said, "we can't keep discussing this here, if anyone hears." Silas interrupted him. "Anyone? You mean the church, or the bank, or the people who already decided the story?" The unknown man said, "That isn't fair." "No," Silas replied. "What isn't fair is a girl disappearing at the harbor wall and the town deciding the water took her." Nora's throat went tight. "Elsie." The tape hissed, then shifted. Her mother spoke again, and this time the fear in her voice was impossible to miss. "Mara, don't," Silas started. "No," she said. "You wanted a record, then hear it." Nora was there. Nora went still. The room seemed to narrow. Pike's voice, faint and distorted, came through the wall again. "Miss Vale." But Nora barely heard him. On the tape, her mother continued in a low rush. She saw the bell room. She saw who came through the passage. She was small, Sela's too small, and you told me she wouldn't remember if we hid it right. But she remembers things she shouldn't, and if she remembers the water. Sela's cut in, furious now. Then they'll come for her. Then they already are. A burst of static erupted through the speaker. The tape warbled, the voices bending in the noise, then jumped forward several seconds. The unknown man was speaking again. His voice was tight with panic. The second girl was never meant to be seen. Nora stopped breathing. The second girl. Elsie. The phrase landed in her mind with a cruel kind of clarity. Sela said it was supposed to look like an accident. Her mother answered, "Nothing about this has been an accident." Then the recording changed again. The next words came more slowly, as if recorded later or at a different place. Her mother's voice, softer now, almost broken. "If Nora comes back, tell her this. Do not look at the water when the clock says 11:13. The water shows you what was taken." The tape hissed. Nora's heartbeat felt too loud to hear anything else. Then one final line, spoken by Sela's, low and urgent. "They know about the tunnel." The cassette clicked to silence. For several seconds, no one moved. The bell above them had gone quiet at last, but the room still seemed to hum with the aftershock of it. Nora stood motionless beside the table, one hand braced against the wood as though the floor might give way under her. Father Hale spoke first. "You should not have heard that." Nora looked at him slowly. "Did you know my mother was involved?" "I knew she tried to stop it." "Stop what?" His jaw tightened. "That is not a simple answer." "Try me." The priest exhaled, and for a moment the hard lines in his face looked older than the church itself. "There was an old drainage passage beneath the harbor wall," he said. "It linked the bell tower to the lower shoreline. It had been used decades ago for repairs, then sealed, then forgotten by everyone except the people who needed it remembered." Nora frowned. Needed it for what? Father Hale did not answer immediately. Then quietly, to move things. Things. Records, money, sometimes people. Her stomach tightened. "My uncle knew." "Yes." "My mother knew." "Yes." "And you." "I knew enough to be afraid." That sounded close to honesty. Not enough to trust, but enough to hurt. Nora picked up the ledger page again, reading the line marked in red. "Witness removed." "Removed where?" Father Hale looked at the wall rather than at her. "From Bellport." "Who was the witness?" Silence. Nora's eyes sharpened. "Answer me." He finally said, "Your mother." The world seemed to tilt. Nora stared at him. "That's impossible. My mother died in Bracken a year later." "Not in Bracken," he said quietly. "In Bellport." She shook her head once, unable to process the words. "No, that's wrong. She left town after the disappearance. I remember." But she didn't. Not clearly. Not enough to say what was real and what had been told to her afterwards so many times it had become memory. Pike's voice suddenly cut through the wall again, harsher now. "Miss Vale, if you're listening, don't let Hale near the box." Father Hale's head snapped up. "He can hear me." "Apparently," Nora said. Pike sounded farther away now, and under his voice she could hear water moving, more water than before, a wet rushing sound that made her skin crawl. "I'm in a maintenance passage behind the east wall," he said. "It runs toward the old sea drain. Someone sealed it from the other side years ago. I think it was meant to hold evidence, or a body, possibly both." Nora went cold. "Can you get out?" "Not through the wall, not yet." "Who sealed it?" A pause. Then Pike said, "If I knew that, I wouldn't be asking you not to trust the wrong people." Father Hale stepped forward. "Detective, if you can hear me, tell her to leave the box alone." Pike gave a rough laugh that held no amusement. "Father, If you're still trying to protect anyone in this town, it's already too late. Nora looked from the priest to the sealed wall. Water was beginning to seep through the mortar in thin, dark lines. The passage behind it was flooding. "No," she whispered. Father Hale followed her gaze and stiffened. "The tide." "What about it?" He looked at the wall with visible dread. "If the old drain is open, the tide will move through the tunnel." "That's bad." "It depends on what else is in there." That was not an answer Nora liked. She turned back to the rusted box, hands shaking now as she lifted out the final item beneath the tape. It was a small brass pendant, shaped like the hand of a clock, the point bent slightly as if it had been torn free of something. On the back, engraved in tiny letters, were 3 words. "For the locker asterisk." She stared at it, then at the key around her own neck, the one she had slipped there after leaving Bellport Bank, the one from locker 113. The pendant matched the keyhole shape on the tin box lid. Nora pressed the pendant against the lid. It fit. A hidden compartment clicked open. Inside was a photograph. Not the one from the bank. Another one. This photograph was older, more faded, and showed a narrow harbor tunnel entrance beneath the wall at low tide. In the foreground stood 3 people. Her uncle Silas, her mother Mara, and a little girl with dark hair tied back by a blue ribbon. Elsie. But there was someone else at the edge of the frame, half out of sight, partially obscured by shadow. A child. Smaller than Elsie. Nora. Her breath stopped. She knew it before the thought had fully formed. She had been there. Not as a bystander. Not as an ignorant child taken along for convenience. She had been there. The photograph shook in her hand. On the back, in her mother's handwriting. If she remembers the tunnel, it means they failed. Nora looked up, a pulse of panic rising in her chest. Father Hale. He was already moving toward the door. "No," he said sharply, "we need to leave." "Why?" "Because someone is coming up the stairs." As if the church itself had overheard him, heavy footsteps sounded below, measured, deliberate, climbing the spiral stair. Not Father Hale's. Not Pike's. Another set. Then another voice, faint but clear enough to make Nora's blood run cold. "Mr. Croft." The solicitor. "Father Hale," Croft called from below, polite as ever. "I know someone is in the tower. It would be best if we discuss the missing records now." Nora stared at the priest. "You told him." "I told no one." Croft's voice continued upward, calm and almost mild. "Miss Vale, if you're there, I think you'll want to hear this. Your uncle left more than a will." Father Hale reached for the recorder and ripped the cassette out, but too late. The tape had already finished, and the silence afterward felt enormous. Then something thudded hard against the church door below. Once. Twice. A third time. The bell rope in the room began to sway, though no one touched it. Nora backed away from the wall, clutching the photograph and the brass pendant. Pike's voice crackled through the gap one last time, urgent and strained. "Nora, listen to me. If Croft reaches the bell room, don't let him near the east wall." Nora stared at the sealed seam in the stone. "Why?" But Pike did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had dropped to a near whisper. "Because that's not the only way in." A section of the floorboard near the table gave a soft click. Nora looked down. A narrow line had opened between 2 boards. Then another. The wood shifted with a dry, ugly sound, and a thin rectangle in the floor slowly lifted from beneath, as if something below had pressed it upward. A hatch. Father Hale went rigid. "Oh God," he whispered, "no." From below the floor came a sudden rush of cold air. And with it the smell of the sea. Nora stared as the hatch lifted a few inches farther, revealing darkness underneath and the first glint of water reflecting the dim church light. Something was coming up through the opening. Something wet. Something that had waited a very long time to be found. The passage under the church. The hatch rose another inch. Cold air pushed through the gap, carrying the smell of brine and rust and something older than all of it. Stale water trapped in stone for decades, maybe longer. Nora stepped back instinctively, the photograph still in one hand, the brass pendant in the other. Father Hale moved first. "Back away," he said, but his voice had gone tight. The floorboard lifted again with a dull scrape. Then a hand appeared, pale, scraped raw at the knuckles, gripping the edge of the hatch from below. Nora froze. The hand tightened. A shoulder followed. Then, with a harsh breath, Detective Rowan Pike hauled himself up through the opening and collapsed onto the church tower floor like a man dragged out of a grave. He was soaked. Not just damp from rain, soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead, coat torn at one sleeve, one cheek streaked with a smear of blood. He braced one hand on the boards, coughed hard, and looked up at Nora with exhausted fury. "You always leave the dramatic entrances to everyone else," he rasped. For a second Nora could only stare. Then the shock broke. "You're alive." Pike gave a short, humorless laugh. "That is usually considered preferable, yes." Father Hale took a quick step toward him, then stopped, suspicion and relief fighting across his face. "I thought you were trapped." "I was." Pike pushed himself to one knee and reached into his coat. His fingers came out clutching a small waterproof pouch, and inside it, Nora could see folded papers and a flash of metal. "The maintenance passage is half collapsed. Someone sealed the lower side after the tide started coming in." "Who?" Nora demanded. Pike looked from her to the open hatch, where dark water glinted below. "That's what I was hoping you'd tell me." Another thud sounded below, this time from the church stairs. Heavy footsteps, fast now, climbing. All three of them turned. A voice floated upward through the bell room, smooth and maddeningly calm. "Miss Vale," Mr. Croft called, "I know you're still here." Nora's skin prickled. Croft did not sound frightened. That was the worst part. He sounded as if he were arriving to settle a debt. Father Hale went pale. "How did he get in?" "Front door," Pike said grimly. "Or a key." Nora stared at him. "You told me not to trust Croft." "I also told you not to trust me," Pike shot back. "You appear to ignore instructions selectively." Croft's footsteps reached the tower stair outside the bell room. The old door shivered once under a hard push. It held. "For now." Pike got to his feet with a wince and wiped water from his face. "We need to leave, through the hatch." Nora looked down into the opening. The darkness below shifted with a low slosh. "Where does it go?" "Under the church," Pike said. "Then under the hill, eventually to the old harbor drain." Father Hale looked horrified. "It's open." "Not for long," Pike said. "Tide's rising." Another thump against the bell room door. This time the wood groaned. Croft's voice again, still calm. "Father Hale, I suggest you open this door before matters become difficult." The priest made a strangled sound under his breath. "He has no authority here." Pike gave him a sharp look. "In Bellport, that depends entirely on who signed the paperwork." Nora couldn't believe the absurdity of it. The blood, the secrets, the hidden passage beneath a church tower, and Croft outside sounding like a man asking to borrow sugar. Then the door rattled again, and the reality returned all at once. Nora shoved the photograph into her coat pocket, then held up the brass pendant. "This belongs to the box," she said, looking at Pike. "My uncle put it there. Why?" Pike's eyes narrowed. "Did you notice the engraving on the back?" "For the locker." He nodded. "Then the box was never meant to stay in the wall. It was meant to move." "Move where?" Before Pike could answer, the door shuddered so hard one of the hinges shrieked. Father Hale took an involuntary step backward. "We're running out of time." Finally, Pike muttered. Nora looked at the hatch again. The water below had risen enough to catch the faint light from the tower window. It reflected in broken ripples against the stone. She couldn't see a ladder, only a narrow set of old iron rungs embedded in the wall. "You expect us to climb down into that?" "I expect us to not stay here when Croft gets in," Pike said. As if to support the point, the bell rope overhead gave one violent twitch. Nora looked up. No one touched it. The rope swung again, once then twice, as if some invisible hand had brushed past it. The bell answered with a single deep note. The sound made all four of them flinch. Croft stopped hammering at the door. For a split second, the whole tower seemed to hold its breath. Then came his voice again, closer now and colder. "Very well." Silence. Then the unmistakable click of a key in the lock. Nora's stomach dropped. "He's got the tower key." Father Hale looked at the door in horror. "Impossible." Pike's face hardened. Nothing is impossible if someone's been planning for 26 years. The lock turned. Nora did not wait to see the door open. She dropped to the hatch, found the first rung, and climbed down into the dark. The air below was damp and freezing. Her boots struck slick iron. Water lapped somewhere out of sight. Above her, Pike was already following, and behind him Father Hale came down with the hesitating urgency of someone descending into his own confession. The hatch was pulled shut overhead, just as a sharp crack rang from the bell-room door. Croft had entered. Nora heard his voice, muffled now by stone and distance. "So that's where you've hidden it." Pike cursed under his breath. He found the wall recess. "What did he expect to find?" Nora whispered. Pike's answer came back at once. "Evidence." The tunnel swallowed the rest of the tower behind them. The passage was narrower than Nora had expected. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture. The floor sloped gently downward toward the harbor, and a thin stream of seawater ran along the center, reflecting the beam of the small flashlight Pike had pulled from his pocket. Iron brackets protruded from the walls every few feet, most empty, some still holding rusted lantern hooks. The ceiling arched low enough that Pike had to duck. They moved in a tight line, Pike first, Nora behind him, Father Hale bringing up the rear with one trembling hand on the wall. The passage smelled of salt and mold and old brick. Nora hugged the wall as they went, trying not to think about what might have been carried through here years ago. Bodies, boxes, records, people. It was not hard to imagine. Bellport had the feel of a place built atop things no one wanted to name. Ahead, Pike stopped and held up a fist. Nora froze. A sound came from farther down the tunnel. Water, lapping, rushing, then striking stone with a sharper slap. "Lower drain," Pike whispered. "The tunnel opens into a service chamber near the old sea gate." "Does that mean we're close to the harbor?" Nora asked. "Yes." She swallowed. "I told you not to sound pleased." "I'm not." He moved on. The floor grew wetter as they continued. In places the seawater covered the stone entirely, and Nora had to step carefully to keep from slipping. Her shoes were already soaked. Her coat dragged at her shoulders. Every now and then she glanced back at Father Hale, who looked steadily more pale with every step. "You knew about this," Nora said quietly. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Not all of it." "You knew enough." "Yes." "Why didn't you stop my uncle?" The priest kept his eyes on the tunnel wall. "I tried." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it is." She wanted to push harder, but then Pike's flashlight swept across something ahead, and he stopped so abruptly that Nora nearly bumped into him. The tunnel widened into a small stone chamber. At one end stood an iron valve wheel crusted with salt. At the other was a stack of rotting crates, some broken open, their contents long since ruined by damp. There were shelves cut into the wall, and on them sat ledgers, rusted tins, and a row of wrapped parcels tied with blue ribbon. Blue again. Nora stared. Pike went very still. "Well," he said softly, "that's not encouraging." The chamber floor was wet but not flooded. The tide had not reached this point yet, though it would soon. Water glimmered around the edges of the stones and under the crates like a warning. Nora stepped forward, her attention caught by a label on one of the nearest parcels. *Val, E. 1998. Her throat tightened. She crouched and tugged the ribbon loose. Inside was a stack of papers sealed in waxed cloth, and a small metal box marked with the same number as the bank locker. 113. Pike crouched beside her. "Don't open every package at once." "Why not?" "Because if Croft is following the same trail we are, he's either looking for one item or trying to destroy all of them." Father Hale's voice came from behind them, low and strained. Those parcels were never supposed to remain in the chamber. Nora looked at the priest. "You said you only knew enough to be afraid." "I did." "Then explain the blue ribbon." He looked at the shelf, at the wrapped parcels, and something in his face collapsed. "Those were records to be moved quietly," he said. "Some were evidence. Some were personal items. Your uncle and your mother used the church passage when they had to move things without the town seeing." Nora stared at him. "My mother was moving things through a hidden tunnel under the church." "Yes." "Why?" "Because Bellport watched everything else." The answer was so grimly plain that it made her angry. "Watched what?" she snapped. "What exactly was everyone so afraid of?" Before the priest could answer, Pike reached for one of the ledgers on the shelf. The cover was swollen with damp, but the title on the spine was still legible. "Town Account Books, Private Asterisk." He opened it. Nora leaned in and saw columns of numbers, names, dates, and notations written in several hands. Some lines had been blacked out. Others were circled. Many had references to maintenance, funds diverted, harbor repairs, bell room access, and bank transfer. "This isn't just old church nonsense," Pike said. "This is a route." Nora frowned. "A route for what?" "For money," he said, tapping the page. "For records, for people. Whoever controlled this passage controlled what entered and left the town's official story." Father Hale closed his eyes briefly. "It was meant to be temporary." Pike barked out a dry laugh. "They all are." Nora turned the pages with shaking fingers. The names on the ledger were mostly unfamiliar, but one appeared often enough to stand out. Croft H**. Twice it was written beside a transfer. 3 times beside inventory adjustments. Once beside a note in the margin. "He knows about the girl." Nora looked up sharply. "Harold Croft." The priest's expression told her everything. "Yes," he said. "You've been letting him handle my uncle's estate." "I didn't know at first what he was doing." Pike's voice went flat. "That sounds suspiciously like you knew later." Father Hale did not deny it. "He came to me after Silas died. He said he was helping settle old parish matters. I believed him." Nora stared at him in disbelief. "You believed him?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because he knew things no outsider should have known." That caught Pike's attention, such as. Father Hale hesitated. The location of the tunnel, the date of the bell room recordings, the name of the witness. Nora's skin went cold. "The witness," she repeated, "my mother." He nodded once. Pike straightened slowly. "What exactly did Croft say?" Father Hale's hands clenched around the edge of the shelf. "He said the town had paid for silence long before my time, and that if I wanted the church to remain untouched, I would not interfere." Nora's heart thudded hard. "So you let him?" "I watched him," the priest said. There is a difference. Pike gave him a look sharp enough to draw blood, only in confession. Then from somewhere above them, a loud metallic crash echoed through the tunnel. All three turned. Croft's voice drifted down through the stone, distorted but unmistakable. "Miss Vale," he called, "I know you found the parcels. Please don't force me to come farther down." The words landed with quiet menace. Nora looked at Pike. "He's in the passage." "Close enough. How many exits does this tunnel have?" Pike glanced toward the dark end of the chamber where the passage continued. One main route to the harbor drain, one side shaft that used to run under the bank district. If the old maps are right, we can get out near the boathouse. "If the maps are right," Nora repeated. Pike met her gaze. "I'm not in the habit of trusting Bellport maps. They're usually lying." The metal crash came again, closer now. Croft must have entered the lower passage. Nora's pulse quickened. What if he followed us? "He did," Pike said. "That's why we keep moving." She looked down at the ledger in her hands. Her mother's name was not on this page, but Silas's appeared often enough to make her stomach knot. These were not merely old parish accounts. They were evidence of a long, careful arrangement, one that involved the church, the bank, the town, and whatever had happened to Elsie Morrow. She opened the next page and found a list of dates. One entry was marked in the margin with a note in her uncle's hand. 11:13/bell equals signal. Under it, drain opens, records move, witness brought in. And below that, written later and harder, as if the pen had nearly torn the page. If Nora comes back, she must not see the water. Her breath caught. The warning from the bank note, the warning from the church room, the same phrase from different hands. "Do not look at the water." She turned to Pike. "What does that mean?" But he was staring at something beyond her shoulder. Nora slowly followed his gaze. At the far end of the chamber, where the tunnel bent out of sight, a thin line of light had appeared across the stone floor. Someone was opening a door. Not behind them. Ahead. A hidden door in the wall had begun to slide inward, and with it came a gust of colder air and a sudden burst of salt-smelling dampness. From the opening, a figure stepped into view. A woman. For one impossible second Nora thought it might be her mother. The shape of the face, the dark hair pulled back, the pale coat soaked at the hem, it was enough to make her whole body lock with shock. Then the woman lifted her head, and Nora saw she was younger than Mara would have been. 40 perhaps, hardened by weather and time, not a ghost. A stranger. The woman's gaze moved from Pike to Father Hale, then settled on Nora with immediate recognition. "Nora Vale," she said quietly, as though saying a name she had been carrying for years. "You were not supposed to come down here." Pike swore under his breath. Father Hale looked as if the floor had been pulled from beneath him. Nora stared at the woman. "Who are you?" The woman's eyes flicked once toward the tunnel behind her, then back again. "My name," she said, "is June Morrow." Nora's breath left her in one hard exhale. Morrow. Elsie's family name. The woman took one step farther into the chamber, rainwater or seawater dripping from the edge of her coat. "I'm the sister your town said was never there," she said. And behind her, somewhere in the tunnel, Croft's voice rose in sudden alarm. "No," he shouted, "don't let her see the shelf." The woman's face changed at once. She turned. Too late. A beam of light flashed from the tunnel entrance, and in that instant Nora saw Croft's shadow stretch across the wall behind June Morrow, long and sharp as a blade. June reached into her coat. Pike moved. Father Hale gasped. And Nora saw, on the shelf beside the ledgers, the edge of a photograph, one she had not noticed before, half hidden under a parcel. The picture showed two children at the harbor. One was Elsie. The other was Nora. But standing just behind them, almost erased by the angle of the shot, was a third child with a blue ribbon in her hair. The child no one had mentioned. The child who was now a grown woman standing in the chamber doorway. June Morrow. And she had just found them. The woman in the passage asterisk. For one long second, nobody moved. June Morrow stood in the tunnel mouth with water dripping from the hem of her coat, her face half lit by Pike's flashlight and half lost in shadow. Nora could only stare at her. The shape of her cheekbones, the set of her mouth, the dark hair pulled back too tightly. It was enough to make Nora feel as if she had stepped sideways into someone else's memory. Then Croft's voice rose again from the passage behind June. "Miss Morrow," he called too politely, "I was hoping you would remain sensible." June's expression hardened at once. "You always did mistake obedience for sense." Pike's flashlight jerked toward the tunnel entrance. "You know her." "I know him," June said without looking at Pike, "and that is worse." Croft appeared in the passage a moment later, one hand resting lightly on the stone wall, as if he were simply taking a stroll rather than stalking through a flooded tunnel beneath a church. His suit was damp at the cuffs, but otherwise immaculate. He carried no weapon that Nora could see, which somehow made him more frightening. His gaze shifted from June to Nora, then to the ledger in Pike's hand, and finally to Father Hale. "Well," he said softly, "this has become tedious." Father Hale took a step backward. "Harold, what have you done?" Croft smiled, though there was nothing warm in it. "What needed doing?" Nora felt Pike stiffen beside her. "You're not supposed to be here." "No," Croft agreed. "I was not supposed to be here today. I had hoped the matter would remain contained." June laughed once, dry and bitter. "Contained, that's what you called it when they took her." Nora's head snapped toward her. "Took who?" June's eyes flicked to her for the first time since entering the chamber. There was grief in them, yes, but something harder too, anger with a long memory. "Elsie," she said. The name hung in the damp air. Nora had heard it enough now that it no longer felt like just a name. It felt like a room opening inside the dark. Croft sighed. "Miss Vale should not be hearing this." "Miss Vale," June repeated sharply, "has already heard too little for too many years." Pike stepped slightly in front of Nora without quite looking like he was doing it. "Enough. If we're going to accuse each other, do it quickly. The tide's rising." Croft's gaze moved to the wall shelves lined with parcels and ledgers. "Then perhaps we should make use of the time we have left." Nora clutched the photograph in her coat pocket so tightly the edge bit into her palm. "You knew my uncle was hiding things." "I knew your uncle was stubborn," Croft said. "A regrettable trait in a man with a guilty conscience." "Guilty of what?" Croft looked at her for a long moment. "Protecting the wrong child." The words hit her like a slap. Pike's head turned slowly toward Croft. "That's a dangerous thing to say." "It's an accurate one." June took a step forward. "Don't you dare rewrite it now. Silas tried to stop you. Mara tried to stop you. And when that failed, you sealed the passage and told everyone the Bell room had collapsed in the storm." Croft's face didn't change. "It did collapse. After you removed the records. After the records were copied." Nora stared between them. "Copied by who?" No one answered. The chamber seemed to contract around the silence. Then Pike spoke, his voice flat. "You mentioned her as if she was still alive." June's chin lifted. "Maybe she is. Maybe she is. That depends on what Bellport decided to do with her." Nora's pulse jumped. "Elsie Morrow." June looked at her, and for the first time her expression softened just enough to make her seem human, not merely furious. "She was my little sister," June said, "and the last person to see her alive was not the tide, no matter what the town said." Croft made a small, unimpressed sound. "You should not repeat rumors." "Rumor?" June snapped. "You mean the report you had rewritten, or the statement you lost, or the mother you frightened into silence." At the word mother, Nora felt the room tilt. My mother, she said slowly, was alive in 1998. June's eyes held hers. Yes. And she knew Elsie. Yes. And she knew me. June hesitated. For the first time, a crack appeared in her composure. More than you remember. That was not an answer. It was a wound. Pike looked from Nora to June and back again. We can do this later, preferably somewhere with less water. Croft glanced toward the passage behind him, where a dull slosh echoed as the tide pushed farther inside the tunnel. You won't make it to the sea gate in time. June's mouth curved. I didn't come here to make it in time. I came here because you did. Croft's eyes narrowed. So did Pike's. Nora could almost feel the shape of old history moving under the words, buried and sharp. June had not appeared by accident. Croft had not come merely to retrieve papers. Pike had known more than he'd said, and somewhere inside the whole structure of lies was a child missing from 26 years ago, and a version of Nora herself that the town had decided to erase. Nora looked at June. Why now? June's gaze flicked toward the wall shelves, to the parcels wrapped in blue ribbon. Because you were finally old enough to ask the right questions. I have been asking questions. No, June said quietly. You have been finding clues. That isn't the same thing. Croft gave a thin smile. And you, June, are you here for questions? I'm here for what you hid. He folded his hands behind his back. And what exactly is that? June stared at him. The truth about the girl in the harbor, the truth about the tunnel, the truth about who was paid to look away. Father Hale made a sound like a prayer swallowed halfway. Pike swore softly. Nora's mind raced. Paid by whom? Croft's gaze slid toward the priest, then to Nora. If we begin naming people, we may be here until the tide takes us. Then speak plainly, Pike said. Croft's expression cooled. Plainly, very well. Bellport was facing a scandal in 1998, smuggling routes through the harbor, illicit transfers, a child wandering where she should not have been, a second child who saw too much, a family already under strain. We contained what could be contained. Nora stared at him in disbelief. You call a missing girl a scandal. I call it a tragedy. You covered it up. We prevented a panic. June gave an ugly laugh. You moved bodies and called it panic prevention. Croft did not flinch. If you insist on melodrama, Miss Morrow, at least be accurate. Pike's jaw tightened. Where was the girl taken? Croft looked at him with a kind of tired contempt. That is the question, isn't it? Nora turned sharply. You don't know. I know what the report says. What report? The one your uncle spent the last few years trying to unearth. Nora's blood went cold. Silas was looking for the report. Yes. Why? Croft's eyes rested on her. Because he believed it would exonerate someone. Who? Croft's mouth flattened. Your mother. The chamber seemed to go still around that. Nora heard water, dripping, rising. Somewhere behind the shelves, a pipe groaned softly under pressure. My mother was blamed. Not officially, Croft said, but indirectly. Rumors were enough. Bellport has always preferred a familiar ghost to an unfamiliar truth. June's voice came hard and immediate. You had her moved. Croft looked at her, and for the first time his calm slipped. She agreed. June stared at him. You lie. No, he drew a slow breath. She agreed if it meant Nora would remain untouched. Nora felt the room snap into a new shape around her. What? Croft's eyes remained on hers. Your mother left Bellport because she was told you would be safer if you were not connected to the story. Nora shook her head once. That's impossible. Pike looked at Croft sharply. What story? Croft did not answer him. June did. The one about what happened at the harbor wall, she said. Nora turned toward her. June's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "The night Elsie disappeared, Nora was there. So was your mother. So was Sela's, someone else too." Nora's mouth had gone dry. "Someone else." June nodded. "And that someone wanted the town to believe the water had taken her." The silence that followed was broken by a slow, metallic creak from deeper in the tunnel. All four of them turned. The sound came again, louder this time, like a valve wheel turning somewhere behind the stone. Pike's flashlight swung toward the passage. "What's that?" Croft's expression changed. "Only a little, but enough." Nora saw it. June saw it too. Father Hale whispered, "No." Croft took a careful step backward. "You should leave this chamber." "No," June said immediately. "Not until she hears it." "Hears what?" June pointed to the lower shelf on the wall. There, half hidden beneath one of the blue ribbon parcels, was a smaller tin envelope. It had not been there before, or perhaps Nora had simply failed to see it in all the shock of the moment. June moved toward it with a kind of grim certainty and set it on the table. "Your uncle left this for you," she said. "If Croft hadn't gotten to it first." Nora stared. "Why are you helping me?" June's eyes flickered toward her with a look Nora could not read. "Because Elsie was my sister. Because Mara was my friend. Because your uncle spent years trying to repair what this town broke. And because I'm tired of being the only one left alive to remember." She opened the tin. Inside was a letter, a folded page of ruled paper, and a small child's shoe. Nora's breath caught. The shoe was tiny, red, and softened by age, the kind a child might wear to church or to the harbor in summer. On the bottom, in faded ink, was written a name. Nora. Her knees nearly gave out. Pike lunged forward and caught the edge of the table. "That's impossible." Nora could not tear her eyes away. "I had shoes like that." June looked at her with something like pity. "You were there." Nora shook her head frantically. "No, I don't remember that." "That's because someone wanted you not to." Croft's voice cut in, sharper now. "Put that away." June turned on him. "Or what?" Before he could answer, the chamber trembled. A deep vibration ran through the stone floor, followed by a rush of water somewhere behind the wall. The sound was subtle at first, then unmistakable. The passage was beginning to flood. Pike cursed and grabbed the ledger from the shelf. "We need to move." Nora looked down at the letter with hands that no longer felt steady. She opened it. The handwriting was her Uncle S. Not the neat script of ledgers and inventories, but hurried, slanted, almost frantic. Nora asterisk. "If you are reading this, June has found you, or I have failed to find her first. Do not believe Croft when he says the town had no choice. It always had a choice. If you must remember one thing, remember this. You were not the one they were trying to hide." The paper blurred. Nora blinked hard and read on. "There is a second memory, and it has been buried deeper than the first. You may not like what it reveals, but you must go to the sea gate before the tide rises above the third mark. Look at the water only once. Then look for the hand. Below that in the margin, a final line. If Pike is with you, watch his reaction when the bell strikes." Nora lowered the letter slowly. Pike, who had been watching her face, asked quietly, "What does it say?" She looked up. And for a second, just one, she saw something she had not expected to see in his expression. Fear. Not of the tunnel, not of the tide. Of the letter. Croft noticed it too. His eyes narrowed. June saw that as well, and her hand moved instantly to the small revolver she had hidden beneath her coat. "Ah," Croft said, and there was no warmth left in his voice. "So that's what this is." The chamber shuddered again. This time the shelf rattled, and one of the wrapped parcels slid to the floor with a wet thump. Water was leaking through the stone near the lower edge of the wall seam, creeping in through hairline cracks. Pike's voice was hard. Everyone stopped talking and started moving. Croft didn't move. He looked at Nora with a strange kind of weariness, almost pity. Your uncle never understood what would happen if the wrong memory returned. Nora felt anger rise through the shock. Then tell me. Croft met her gaze, and for the first time he looked less like a polished solicitor and more like an old man standing on the edge of a grave he had helped dig. Because if you remember the harbor, he said quietly, you will remember who was holding your hand when Elsie was taken. The tunnel seemed to collapse inward around her words. Nora's heart slammed once, hard enough to hurt. The hand, the note, the warning not to look at the water, her own childhood shoe, and the man in the coat. Pike stared at Croft. What did you just say? But Nora had stopped hearing them. The chamber floor tilted, or perhaps her memory did. The sound of the tide became the sound of rain. The darkness behind the church became the harbor wall. The red shoe in her hand became something wet and cold and small. A flash. Only a flash. A child's cry. A bell ringing. A woman shouting her name. And a hand, gloved or wet or both, gripping her wrist beside black water at 11:13. Nora gasped and stumbled backward. The photograph in her coat slipped loose and fell to the floor. As it landed face up in the water creeping across the stone, the image changed under the moving surface. The girl in the picture was no longer smiling at the harbor wall. She was looking toward the camera. Not at it. Toward the person holding it. And behind the children, half hidden in shadow, a man in a dark coat stood with one hand outstretched. Nora looked up slowly. Pike had gone very still. The bell from the church tower above them gave a single distant strike. And in that same instant, Nora remembered the face of the man in the coat. Not clearly, not fully, but enough.